Let me take you back, not just to another time, but to another rhythm of life. In the soft, low lands of Arkell, where the rivers curved gently through clay-rich fields, there lived a man named Huibert den Hartog. He was not a rich man, nor a man of titles, though the name he bore, Den Hartog, whispered faint echoes of a noble past. But by the mid-1800s, such legacies were buried beneath layers of toil, humility, and the dark, fertile earth. My grandfather, Huibert den Hartog, was born on April 4, 1869 in the village of Everdingen, just a short distance from Hagestein, in the heart of the Netherlands. His life was not extraordinary by the standards of kings and scholars, but it was deeply woven into the soil of this region, through hard labor, quiet endurance, and familial duty. Huibert was a laborer his entire life, often working land he rented to provide for his family. The year was 1869, and the air in the village of Everdingen was thick with the scent of wet soil and fresh grass. It was a time when the heart of the Netherlands still beat to the rhythm of the land, a world of gentle rivers, windmills, and the quiet hum of daily labor. Two villages, one river. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Dutch landscape was changing rapidly, yet in the riverlands between the Lek and Leentje, time seemed to slow. Here lay Everdingen and Hagestein, flanking the narrow, winding river Lek like twin sentinels. Modest in size, mostly agricultural in nature, these towns bore silent witness to the clash between tradition and progress. Though Everdingen lay in the province of Utrecht and Hagestein briefly in South Holland, until rejoining Utrecht in the 20th century, their histories were deeply entwined. United by their riverine geography, water management challenges, and a culture shaped by hard work, faith, and a strong local identity. It was here, in this small farming village on the banks of the Lek River, that Huibert den Hartog was born. He was the son of Gerrit den Hartog, a modest farmer, and Leentje van Harmelen, a strong, practical woman with a sharp eye for detail. Huibert's early years were defined by the simple but steady pulse of rural life. Days were measured not by the hands on the clock, but by the rhythm of the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in late summer, and the long, quiet winters spent inside with family. The family lived in a small, humble cottage with a thatched roof, tucked behind the rows of orchards that lined the village's outskirts. In the mornings, as a child, Huibert would wake to the sounds of his father's sturdy boots hitting the cold floorboards, followed by the soft rustle of his mother's apron as she prepared breakfast. The smell of warm bread often filled the kitchen, mixed with the earthy scent of wood smoke from the small hearth. Breakfast was simple, perhaps a slice of thick black bread with butter, or gruel made from the grains they grew themselves. It was a time when nothing was wasted, and every meal, no matter how humble, was a blessing. The people, farmers, laborers, and river folk in 1869, both Everdingen and Hagestein were essentially agrarian societies. Families had tilled the fertile floodplains of the Lek for centuries. The soil, rich from the river's deposits, yielded potatoes, wheat, beets, and flax. Most families lived in extended households, often combining farming with small-scale crafts like basket weaving, cheesemaking, and carpentry. Social structures were fairly rigid. The landowning boeren, or farmers, formed the backbone of local leadership. Below them were the arbeiders, or laborers, who worked on the farms or in seasonal river maintenance, such as reinforcing the dikes. The river brought not just life but also danger. Floods were common memories, particularly the great flood scares of the 19th century. Life here demanded respect for the water, not fear, but vigilance. The people of Everdingen and Hagestein lived by the calendar of nature, not the clock. In spring, the Lek would swell with snowmelt from the Rhine, pressing against dikes reinforced by generations of men with spades and shovels. Elders told stories of earlier floods, like the near catastrophes of the early 1800s, and how the Heemraden, or dike wardens, had saved the land by cutting through an upstream dike to lower the water. Fields awakened slowly. Lambs wobbled through pastures, and women worked in their vegetable plots. The air smelled of peat, cattle, and fresh river mud. The world Huibert knew was small, but in its smallness, there was a kind of richness. His days were spent in the fields, helping his father tend the crops, potatoes, beets, and barley, the staple foods of his family's diet. The cold, muddy riverbanks became his playground, where he would fish with his father, learning to cast a line as the seasons passed. By the time Huibert turned 10, the local village had begun to feel the ripples of change. The industrial age was creeping its way into the countryside, bringing with it the rise of machines and modern tools, but it wasn't in Huibert's world just yet. The land was still tilled by hand, and the harvest still depended on the rhythm of the seasons and the strength of the body. At 14, Huibert was already becoming a strong young man, his hands calloused from years of hard labor. He worked alongside his father, learning the ways of the land. His world was not one of books or classrooms, but of dirt under fingernails, the scent of fresh hay, and the distant hum of windmills turning in the breeze. But as much as he loved the land, Huibert could feel the stirrings of a larger world beyond the familiar contours of Everdingen. In the evenings, after the work was done, he and his friends would gather around the village's small church, listening to the clanging of the church bells and the stories told by the village elders. The simple truth of God's providence was a thread that ran through their lives, shaping their views and giving purpose to their work. Faith and the church, piety in a changing age. The churches of Everdingen and Hagestein were more than houses of worship, they were community anchors. The Dutch Reformed Church was dominant, but the Doliandy movement of 1886 and later the Gereformeerd Kerk splits deeply affected local life. Many families split along theological lines, some forming their own Gereformeerd congregations based on stricter Calvinist interpretations. Ministers held great influence. Sermons addressed not just theology but often moral instruction, family life, and even labor relations. Sunday was sacred, no work, no river traffic, just rest and reflection. Church attendance approached 90%. Though isolated, the world slowly crept in. In 1883, a traveling photographer visited Hagestein and captured the first portraits of its people, faces tense and unfamiliar with the lens. In 1905, a mobile cinema wagon passed through Everdingen. Villagers gathered in awe to watch moving images of soldiers marching and horses galloping, images from distant lands. In his early 20s, Huibert began to make his own way in the world. He took on odd jobs, anything that would help the family earn a bit more for the winter. He worked as a laborer for local farmers during harvest time, hauling wood, digging trenches for irrigation, and mending fences along the fields. But despite the long hours and the constant work, Hubert's heart always seemed to return to a place of stillness, where faith, family, and the earth were one. Every Sunday, Huibert attended church, dressed in his best jacket, and stood with the other men in the village, hands clasped behind their backs. Their faces solemn as the preacher spoke of salvation and duty. A typical day in 1900 Everdingen began at dawn. Roosters crowed, shutters creaked open, and smoke drifted from farmhouse chimneys. Fathers and sons walked to the pastures, daughters helped bake, clean, or sew. In the evening, whole families gathered around a kerosene lamp, listening to Protestant psalms or reading aloud from the Bible. Children went barefoot from April to October. Shoes were saved for Sundays and winter. They played in the meadows, caught frogs in the canals, and were always warned, "Don't go too close to the dike, child." Life was modest, but dignified. Almost every household owned a Bible, a cow, a spinning wheel, and a long tradition of genealogical memory, knowing precisely who begot whom, back 6 or 7 generations. Weddings were village events, small, sober ceremonies followed by farmyard feasts, local cheeses, and beer brewed by a farmer's cousin. Widows wore black for life. Death announcements were delivered by hand. Bells tolled for births, deaths, and dike breaches alike. It was around the turn of the century, in 1901, when Hubert's life took a turn toward a new chapter. Leentje Lakerveld was a young woman from the neighboring village of Lakerveld. They met at a local festival, a harvest celebration where farmers and their families gathered to mark the end of the year's labor. Huibert had noticed her from across the barn, her dark eyes sparkling with laughter as she danced with the other women. As the evening drew on, their paths crossed, and what started as a polite greeting soon turned into a lively conversation. Huibert, who was typically reserved, found himself drawn to her laughter, the way she spoke about the land, the simple joys of life, and her hopes for the future. On November 21, 1901, in a small, modest ceremony in Everdingen, Huibert and Leentje were married. The village church was filled with a sense of simplicity and warmth, as family and friends gathered to witness the union. The bells rang out over the village. After the ceremony, they shared a humble but joyful meal with their families, sitting together at the long wooden tables in the warmth of the Lakerveld farmhouse. Laughter filled the room, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. And so, Huibert den Hartog's early life was shaped by faith, family, and hard labor. He had learned the importance of perseverance and the value of simple joys. Now, with Leentje by his side, he would build a future together, one that would shape the lives of their children and grandchildren for generations to come. Though male-dominated, the society of Everdingen and Hagestein relied heavily on women. They tended gardens, managed poultry, preserved food, and bore many children, often 6 to 10 in a household. They were also the spiritual guides, ensuring family prayers, catechism, and Sunday preparation. By the 1920s, changes emerged. Some girls began to attend household school, or domestic science school, in towns like Culemborg or Vianen. They learned hygiene, child rearing, and even bookkeeping, marking a subtle modernization of the female role. Yet they were still expected to marry young and well, preferably within the community or neighboring Protestant villages. Though Everdingen and Hagestein weren't political hotspots, national issues filtered down. From the 1870s to the 1890s, the rise of pillarization began to structure social life along religious and ideological lines. Protestant, Catholic, socialist, and liberal communities had their own schools, clubs, and newspapers. Between 1901 and 1917, the Anti-Revolutionary Party and Christian Historical Union dominated in these conservative Protestant villages. Local mayors and school boards reflected that. From 1917 to 1919, universal male suffrage and school funding reform, known as the Skolstrid, had a tangible effect. Families could now send children to publicly funded religious schools, a victory for these communities. By the 1930s, as economic depression set in and Nazi ideology spread across the border, Hagestein and Everdingen remained staunchly conservative and monarchist. Hitler had no appeal here, but anxieties about war, unemployment, and Dutch neutrality were growing. When Huibert den Hartog married Leentje Lakerveld on November 21, 1901, in the little church of Everdingen, they were young, in love, and standing at the beginning of a life that would bring both profound joy and unimaginable sorrow. Their first child, Gerrit, was born on November 3, 1903. He would grow up to become a thoughtful and resourceful man, but in those early days, he was simply the wide-eyed eldest son, a new chapter in a family story that was just beginning. Over the years, 7 children would be born to Huibert and Leentje. 5 would grow into adulthood, building families of their own. But 2 precious lives were lost in childhood, a grief no parent ever forgets. One of those was Bastiaan Gerrit den Hartog, whose story would live on in whispered memories, old photographs, and the gentle warnings of a protective father to the next generation. The early decades of the 20th century brought slow but steady change to rural Everdingen. Life was still measured by the rhythm of the seasons, the harvest, and the church bell, but the world outside was beginning to hum with progress. Huibert rose before dawn each day to tend to his land, his body shaped by hard work and the deep connection to the soil beneath his feet. Leentje kept the house running with quiet strength, her hands always busy, sewing, baking, caring for the children. The family had little in terms of material wealth, but they were rich in resilience, rooted in faith, and surrounded by the kind of community where everyone helped everyone. Neighbors shared tools, traded eggs for flour, and told stories over fence posts. 3 figures held unique respect in the community. The schoolmaster, often trained in Utrecht, brought grammar, geography, and discipline into the lives of rural children. He walked with a cane, not because he needed it, but to maintain order. The blacksmith kept the wheels of village life turning, sharpening plows, shoeing horses, and repairing locks and iron gates. His forge was the local hub for news and gossip. The Dominee, the minister and moral compass, preached long sermons and paid pastoral visits, often by bicycle, through sleet and mud. He was both feared and loved, consulted in matters from marriage disputes to theological doubt. When World War I broke out in 1914, young Gerrit was just 11 years old. Though the Netherlands remained neutral, the war cast a long shadow even here. Trade slowed. Food grew scarce. Essentials like soap, coffee, and tea were harder to come by. Huibert stretched every guilder, and the family learned to make do, baking with less sugar, patching clothes over and over again, sharing everything. The First World War, from 1914 to 1918, never reached the Netherlands physically, but there was military mobilization. Young men from Everdingen and Hagestein served as conscripts, stationed at Fort Everdingen, guarding against a possible German incursion. These men came home with new ideas, stories, and habits. Some now smoked, others read newspapers, a few had seen Amsterdam for the first time. steam pumping stations replaced windmills for water management. The railroad expansions in nearby Culemborg and Geldermalsen increased mobility and trade. Everdingen's farmers could now send dairy, eggs, and vegetables to markets in Utrecht and Rotterdam. The brick industry, especially in Vianen and Culemborg, attracted laborers from Everdingen. The crisis years of the 1930s brought hardship. Plummeting milk prices, failing crops, and work relief programs, or werkverschaffing, that sent men to dig canals, plant forests, or maintain dikes for minimal pay. But the Rivierbor endured. Their life was cyclical and deeply connected to the rhythm of the rivers, the land, and the church bells. Despite hardship, communal bonds held. The church organized food drives. Children sang Dankliederen, or Thanksgiving songs, after receiving government-issued boots or coats. The village teacher organized Christmas plays with homemade costumes, and elders reminded the young of previous hard times and God's providence. There were rumors of revolution, of communists, and by the late 1930s, of Hitler. But here, in the shadow of the river, people held fast to Queen Wilhelmina, God's justice, and the promise of spring's return. June 21, 1930, it was the first day of summer. The river, the Lek, near Hagestein, was high and swift, but it sparkled in the midday sun, beckoning the village boys to its cool embrace. Swimming in the river was a common pastime. There were no pools, no lifeguards, only instincts and strength. Bastiaan went swimming that day and never came home. Whether it was the current, exhaustion, or a misstep, no one truly knew. What is certain is that he drowned, and his body was found later, claimed by the waters that had so often offered escape and play. He was just a boy, strong, kind, and full of promise, gone in an instant. The loss shattered the family. Huibert and Leentje, already weathered by life, aged in a single afternoon. Bastiaan's story became a quiet legacy, not only a caution, but a reminder of the fragility of joy. By the 1920s, better roads and consolidation allowed for higher quality rural education, though secondary education required travel to places like Culemborg or Vianen. A handful of bright students left for seminaries or technical schools. Most, however, stayed. Education was valued but secondary to faith and labor. Electricity arrived in the 1920s. Radio in the 1930s. The world was slowly coming in, but still through a local lens. By the time World War II broke out, Gerrit had been married for 12 years. He had learned from his father how to prepare for hard times. As tensions rose across Europe, he began quietly hoarding coffee, tea, soap, and other necessities. He knew what scarcity looked like, and when the German occupation of the Netherlands began, that foresight helped his family survive. Back in Everdingen, Huibert and Leentje were now grandparents, watching the world darken once again. But they remained what they had always been: steady, faithful, and rooted. They had endured drought, flood, war, and death. They had raised children through hardship and grief, and they had done it together. Their story is not one of grandeur, but of quiet heroism, passed down not in medals or monuments, but in the character and memories of those who came after. Fort Everdingen, part of Holland's waterlinie. Though already obsolete by World War I, it stood as a symbol of Dutch defense ingenuity. When needed, lowlands could be intentionally flooded to stop invaders. By 1939, Fort Everdingen was manned again. Anti-aircraft guns were tested, military trucks rumbled down gravel paths. Children watched wide-eyed as soldiers marched and sang. Some men were called to mobilize. Many didn't come back in 1940, when the Germans crossed the border and parachutes fell over Dordrecht and Rotterdam. By the spring of 1940, the signs were undeniable. Germany's aggression in Europe was no longer distant news, it was a looming storm cloud over the flat fields of the Netherlands. The invasion began on May 10th, and within 5 days, Dutch resistance had collapsed under the might of the German blitzkrieg. In Everdingen, the rhythm of village life was upended overnight. In Hagestein, villagers gathered in basements as Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead. In Everdingen, the fort was shelled, briefly held, then abandoned. The invasion was fast and decisive. In June 1940, silence fell over the Lek. The bells rang again, this time not for joy or death, but to mark the beginning of a long, dark occupation, the threshold of war. Everything changed. The German invasion shattered decades of neutrality and gradual progress. In Everdingen, troops passed the old fortifications, mostly untouched. In Hagestein, families hid in cellars as warplanes thundered overhead en route to Rotterdam. And so this chapter of quiet rural life came to a dramatic end, just as another darker one was beginning. Soldiers marched past dikes and farmsteads, commandeered homes, and imposed curfews. The flag of the Third Reich flew over Dutch soil, and silence fell like a shroud over markets and churches. Huibert den Hartog was 42 years into his marriage with Leentje. His hair had long turned white, and though his frame remained tall, his hands trembled slightly from age and years of toil. He watched the occupation with stoic concern. The Den Hartogs were no rebels, but they resisted in their own way, with dignity, with mutual care, with perseverance. He passed away quietly, just before Christmas, on the 24th of December that year, at home, in Everdingen, surrounded by the land and the people he had loved. There were no great headlines to mark his death, no funeral processions, only the mourning of a family who knew what they had lost. His passing was a moment of stillness in the midst of a world gone mad. Outside, the war raged on. But in the Den Hartog home, his memory lived like a gentle flame, a reminder of what endurance looks like, of what it means to live a faithful life through uncertainty. Huibert left behind a family shaped by hardship, yes, but also by faith, by compassion, and by that same unshakable strength that had carried him through so many trials. In the years to come, his sons and daughters would tell his story. They would speak of his steady hand, his deep faith, and the way he faced both joy and loss with the same quiet resolve. They would remember how he held them close after Bastiaan's death, how he worked the land with reverence, how he said grace with tears in his eyes during the hungry winters. And they would remember how, even in the shadow of Nazi occupation, he remained who he always had been. A father, a husband, a pillar, a man of the land, and of God. And though the castles of Arkel were long crumbled, and the coats of arms forgotten by most, in the stillness of a Dutch morning, something noble still lived on. In men like my grandfather, Huibert den Hartog. Though now bypassed by highways and overshadowed by larger towns, Everdingen and Hagestein still carry the echoes of those 70 years, a time of simplicity and depth, of quiet faith and endurance. Their story reminds us that even the smallest places shape and are shaped by the great currents of history. You can still walk the dikes and hear the whispers of girls laughing under apple trees, of church bells tolling the hour, of barges sliding past on the Lek, and of a people who held fast between heaven, land, and water.